Alice Tucker noticed the ring before she noticed the smile. Madison Cole walked into the executive conference room like she belonged there. Heels sharp against marble floors, silk coat draped over one shoulder, confidence spilling from every step. Then she placed her hand on the table beside Alice's laptop. A diamond flashed under the fluorescent lights. Alice's diamond. The same vintage ring Jason had slipped onto her finger 12 years earlier while promising she would always be the only woman in his life. Around the room, conversations died quietly. Someone looked away. Someone else pretended to check their phone. Madison only smiled. "I guess Jason forgot to mention," she said softly. "He said he was finally free." Alice didn't scream, didn't cry. That night, she poured herself a glass of wine and sent one email that would destroy everything Jason Tucker had built. If you've ever stayed loyal to someone who mistook your love for weakness, this story will hit harder than you expect. And before we begin, tell me in the comments what would you have done if you were Alice. By the time Alice Tucker pulled into the driveway that night, the sky over the Chicago suburbs had turned charcoal gray. Rain tapped softly against the windshield, blurring the warm lights glowing from inside the house she had spent 12 years turning into a home. For a long moment, she just sat there with both hands gripping the steering wheel. Her wedding ring finger felt strangely cold. Madison's voice kept replaying in her head. He said he was finally free. Alice swallowed hard and finally stepped out of the car. The Tucker house stood exactly the way it always had. Perfect landscaping, white stone exterior, giant windows glowing with expensive warmth. It looked like the kind of marriage people envied online, and that was the cruelest part. From the outside, Alice and Jason Tucker looked untouchable. Power couple, charity galas, luxury vacations, magazine-worthy Christmas parties. But appearances were expensive things, and Alice had been the one paying for them emotionally for years. She entered quietly, dropping her purse near the kitchen island. The house smelled faintly like Jason's cologne and the rosemary candles she always bought in winter. There was no sign of him. Of course there wasn't. Lately, Jason was never home before 10. Board meetings, client dinners, networking events, excuses wrapped in $1,000 suits. Alice walked upstairs slowly and stopped in front of the framed wedding photo hanging in the hallway. 12 years ago, she had looked radiant. Jason had looked at her like she was the center of his universe. Now she stared at that woman in the photograph and barely recognized her. Back then, Alice Tucker had dreams of her own. Before becoming Jason's wife, she had been ambitious, brilliant, magnetic. She graduated near the top of her class in nonprofit healthcare management and once dreamed of running national women's health initiatives. Then she met Jason. Jason Tucker was charming in the way dangerous men often were. Confident, intelligent, the kind of man who could make a room revolve around him within minutes. When they married, Jason was still struggling to climb the corporate ladder at Horizon Healthcare Group. Alice helped him every step of the way. She organized networking dinners, managed charity events, introduced him to investors through her own professional contacts, proofread presentations at 2 a.m, calmed him during panic attacks before major meetings. There were entire projects Jason received credit for that Alice had quietly helped build from scratch. But nobody knew that, because Alice made sure nobody knew that. She believed love meant partnership, sacrifice, loyalty. And slowly over the years, Jason learned something terrifying about her. Alice would always clean up the mess, so he stopped appreciating her. Then he stopped seeing her. Then he started treating her like furniture, useful, dependable, invisible. Alice walked into the bedroom and saw Jason's side of the closet partially empty again, another business trip bag missing, another unexplained overnight stay. She opened one of the drawers absent-mindedly, then froze. His ring box was still there, empty. A sharp ache spread through her chest. Jason hadn't lost the ring. He had given it away. The realization hit harder now than it had in the conference room. Alice sat on the edge of the bed, breathing carefully. A memory surfaced suddenly. 3 months earlier. "You don't wear your ring anymore," she had said quietly, while they prepared for a fundraiser dinner. Jason barely looked up from his phone. "I lost it at the gym." Alice remembered how quickly he answered. Too quickly. And when she offered to replace it, Jason became irritated. "Why are you making such a big deal out of a ring? Because it wasn't about the ring. It was about what it represented." Back then, Alice ignored the feeling in her stomach. Women like Alice were trained to ignore themselves, to be understanding, patient, flexible, accommodating, especially in wealthy suburban circles where perfect marriages mattered more than happy ones. A loud garage door rattled downstairs. Jason was home. Alice wiped her face quickly before standing. Moments later, he entered the bedroom, loosening his tie. Tall, expensive, controlled. Still devastatingly handsome at 43. Jason stopped when he saw her. "You're awake." Alice stared at him. It amazed her how normal he looked, how ordinary betrayal could appear. "You gave her my ring." Jason's expression changed for less than a second, but Alice saw it, that tiny flicker of panic. Then came the performance. "Alice, no," she interrupted softly. "Don't insult me by lying tonight." Jason exhaled sharply and tossed his keys onto the dresser. "You embarrassed yourself today." The words hit like a slap. Alice blinked. "I embarrassed myself?" "You've been acting paranoid for months." Jason's voice hardened. "Madison works with me. She wears jewelry. You jump to conclusions in front of people." Alice almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because she suddenly realized how long Jason had been rewriting reality around her. Gaslighting didn't always sound cruel. Sometimes it sounded calm, professional, reasonable. That was what made it dangerous. "She said you were finally free," Alice whispered. Jason rubbed his jaw impatiently. "Madison likes attention, that's all. And my wedding ring." Silence. Heavy, suffocating. Jason finally looked away first. That hurt more than the confession would have. Alice felt something crack quietly inside her chest. Not explosive, not dramatic, just final. "You know what your problem is," Jason muttered. "You live in your emotions. Everything becomes a crisis." Alice stared at him in disbelief. 12 years. 12 years of loyalty, sacrifice, emotional labor, support, and somehow she had become the problem. Jason stepped closer. "I'm exhausted, Alice. Every time I walk into this house lately, you're tense, suspicious, emotional, because you're cheating on me." The sentence landed between them like shattered glass. Jason's jaw tightened. But he still didn't deny it. That was the moment Alice understood the marriage was already dead. Not because he loved another woman, but because he no longer respected the truth. Jason sighed dramatically like she was inconveniencing him. "I don't want to fight tonight." Alice looked at him carefully. Really looked at him. At the arrogance. The entitlement. The confidence that she would forgive him no matter what he did. Because she always had. Until now. Jason moved toward the bathroom. "We'll talk tomorrow." "No," Alice said quietly. Something in her tone made him pause. "What? We won't." Jason frowned slightly, but before he could respond, Alice turned away and walked toward the window. The city lights flickered faintly in the distance, beyond the rain. Behind her, Jason disappeared into the bathroom like nothing had happened, like their marriage hadn't just bled out onto the bedroom floor. Alice stood there in silence. Then slowly, very slowly, her expression changed. The grief was still there. The heartbreak, too. But underneath it now was something colder, something awake. And for the first time in years, Alice Tucker stopped wondering how to save her marriage. And started wondering how much damage the truth could do. The first time Alice Tucker met Madison Cole, she understood immediately why men like Jason destroyed their lives over women like her. Madison walked into the annual Horizon Healthcare Winter Fundraiser wearing a black satin dress that looked poured onto her body. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over one shoulder, and her smile carried the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly what effect she had on people, especially men, especially married men. Alice noticed the shift in the room before Jason even introduced them. Executives straightened. Women glanced at each other quietly. Waiters suddenly became more attentive. Madison absorbed attention naturally, like oxygen. "Alice," Jason said smoothly, placing a hand against Madison's back. "This is Madison Cole. She's consulting on the expansion project." Madison extended her hand. Her nails were pale pink and perfect. "So nice to finally meet you," she said warmly. "Finally." The word lodged itself in Alice's chest strangely. Alice forced a polite smile and shook her hand. "You too." But Madison didn't let go immediately. Her eyes moved across Alice's face carefully, studying, measuring, like she already knew more than she should. Jason spent the rest of the evening orbiting Madison. Not obviously. Jason Tucker was too polished for obvious. But Alice noticed every detail because wives always noticed the details. The way Jason laughed harder at Madison's jokes. The way his posture changed when she touched his arm. the way Madison leaned closer when she spoke to him. And worst of all, the way Jason looked alive around her. Alice stood near the silent auction tables pretending to examine a framed wine package while humiliation crawled slowly up her throat. "You okay, Alice?" turned and found Sophie Miller beside her, holding 2 champagne glasses. Sophie had worked with Alice for nearly 6 years and possessed the dangerous quality of being emotionally observant. Alice accepted the glass carefully. "I'm fine." Sophie glanced across the ballroom toward Madison. "No, you're not." Alice looked away immediately. "I'm probably overthinking it," maybe Sophie said gently, but maybe not. Alice hated how quickly tears threatened behind her eyes these days. She used to be strong, confident, grounded. Now she felt like a woman constantly apologizing for her own instincts. Across the ballroom, Madison laughed at something Jason said and touched his chest lightly. The movement was small, intimate, practiced. Alice suddenly couldn't breathe properly. "I need air." She escaped onto the terrace overlooking the frozen Chicago riverfront. The cold wind hit her instantly. For a few seconds she just stood there gripping the railing. Then she heard heels behind her. "Madison." "Of course." "You left so suddenly," Madison said casually. Alice straightened. "I just needed a minute." Madison stepped beside her completely uninvited. Up close her perfume smelled expensive and sharp. "I know corporate events can be exhausting," Madison said sympathetically, "especially when you're not really part of that world anymore." Alice blinked slowly. The insult had been delivered perfectly, soft enough to deny, sharp enough to wound. Alice turned toward her. "What exactly is that supposed to mean?" Madison tilted her head innocently. "Oh, nothing bad." A pause. "Jason just talks a lot about how hard it's been for you adjusting." Something cold moved through Alice's stomach. "What does Jason say about me?" Madison smiled faintly. "That you've become sensitive lately." There it was again. Sensitive, emotional, difficult. The words men used when women noticed disrespect. Alice stared at Madison carefully now. This woman wasn't accidentally crossing boundaries. She was enjoying it. "He shouldn't discuss our marriage with coworkers," Alice said quietly. Madison looked directly at her then, and for one terrifying second the friendliness disappeared completely. "What makes you think I'm just a coworker?" Alice felt her heartbeat stumble. Before she could respond, the terrace doors opened again. Jason stepped outside. "There you are," he said to Madison first. "Not Alice." Madison smiled immediately. "I was just keeping your wife company." Jason's eyes flickered briefly toward Alice. Something unreadable passed between them. Then Jason slipped his hand against Madison's lower back casually. Too casually, like it already belonged there. Alice saw it, and Jason saw her seeing it, but neither of them spoke. That silence followed Alice home. Over the next several weeks, Madison became impossible to ignore. She appeared everywhere, board lunches, weekend charity events, private dinners that somehow turned into group dinners once Madison happened to join. Jason always had explanations ready. "She's important to the project. She's helping secure investors. You're making this weird." That last one became his favorite. "You're making this weird," as if Alice's discomfort was more offensive than his behavior. One afternoon, Alice arrived unexpectedly at Jason's office with coffee. His assistant looked startled when she walked in. "Mr. Tucker is in a strategy meeting." Alice nodded politely. "No problem, I'll wait." The assistant hesitated too long. That was all it took. Alice walked toward Jason's office before anyone could stop her. The door wasn't fully closed. Inside, Madison sat on the edge of Jason's desk. Too close, too comfortable. Jason looked up sharply when he saw Alice. Madison didn't move at all. "Alice." Jason said quickly, standing. "What are you doing here?" The question hurt more than it should have. "What are you doing here at her husband's office?" Alice lifted the coffee tray slightly. "I brought lunch." Madison smiled slowly. "That's sweet." Alice ignored her. Jason immediately stepped into the hallway and shut the office door behind him. Behind him, separating Alice from Madison, from whatever had been happening inside. "You could have texted first," Jason muttered. Alice stared at him. "I didn't realize visiting my husband required scheduling approval." Jason rubbed his forehead impatiently. "You're creating tension where there doesn't need to be any." Alice looked past him toward the office door. Why was she sitting on your desk? Jason laughed once in disbelief. Seriously? Yes, seriously. She's a consultant, Alice. We were working. Alice almost asked if consultants usually wore lipstick shades smeared across whiskey glasses, too. Instead, she said quietly, "People are noticing." Jason's face hardened instantly. "You know what people notice? Your insecurity." The sentence landed like a knife. Alice stepped backward slightly. Jason lowered his voice. "You've changed." "No," Alice whispered. "I think I finally started paying attention." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jason checked his watch, an obvious dismissal. "I have a meeting." Alice nodded slowly. Of course he did. That night, Alice sat alone in the kitchen while rain hammered against the windows. Jason texted around 11, "Staying downtown. Don't wait up, no heart emoji, no explanation, nothing." Alice stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then her eyes drifted toward the counter, where Jason's spare receipts sat beside his watch. Normally, she ignored them. Tonight, she picked them up. Most were ordinary: parking, restaurants, hotel valet. Then she found it. A luxury penthouse lease agreement, downtown Chicago, 6-month contract, paid in full, Jason Tucker. Alice's hand started shaking violently. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note from the leasing agent. "Congratulations to you both on the beautiful new place." Alice stopped breathing, because suddenly, everything made sense. Alice barely slept after finding the penthouse lease. She lay awake in the darkness beside Jason's empty side of the bed, staring at the ceiling while her thoughts spiraled into places she had spent months trying to avoid. He rented another home. For them. Not for business, not for meetings, for them. The humiliation of it burned hotter than the betrayal itself. Because Jason hadn't simply cheated, he had been building a second life while still coming home every night, expecting Alice to wash his shirt, smile at charity events, and play the role of devoted wife. By morning, Alice felt hollowed out. Jason returned around 7:30 looking polished and rested carrying coffee like a man returning from an ordinary business meeting instead of another woman's bed. "You're up early," he said casually. Alice looked at him across the kitchen island. There was lipstick near the collar of his coat. Not enough for certainty, just enough for cruelty. "I couldn't sleep." Jason loosened his tie. "Big dinner tonight, don't forget." Alice had forgotten, or maybe she had hoped to. Dinner at the Tucker estate was a monthly ritual she secretly dreaded, an evening of subtle humiliation wrapped in expensive wine and fake sophistication. Jason's parents never openly disliked her. That would have been easier. Instead, they treated Alice like a woman who had almost been enough, almost impressive enough, almost polished enough, almost worthy enough. By 6:30 that evening, Alice stood in front of the bathroom mirror, fastening diamond earrings with trembling fingers. Jason adjusted his cufflinks behind her. "You're quiet." Alice met his eyes in the mirror. "I'm tired." Jason gave a short laugh. "You're always tired lately. Not guilty, not apologetic. Annoyed." That was what hurt the most. Alice turned slowly. How long? Jason's expression flattened instantly. "What? How long has it been going on with Madison?" For one brief second, something dark flickered behind his eyes. Then he smiled, not warmly, strategically. "Alice, we are not doing this before dinner." The calmness of his tone made her feel insane, as if she were asking about the weather instead of another woman sleeping in a penthouse he paid for. "You rented her an apartment." Jason grabbed his watch from the counter. "It's corporate housing. You expect me to believe that? I expect you." He snapped suddenly to stop acting like a paranoid teenager. The cruelty hit hard enough to physically sting. Alice stared at him. Jason immediately softened his tone again. Classic Jason. "Push." Then smooth it over before the bruise fully formed. "You've been emotional for months," he said more quietly. "You read into everything." Emotional. There it was again. Alice wondered how many women had stayed trapped in miserable marriages simply because men convinced them their instincts were instability. Jason stepped closer. "We're going to dinner. We're going to act like adults." Understood. Alice didn't answer. Because suddenly she realized something terrifying. Jason no longer feared hurting her. He only feared inconvenience. The Tucker estate sat on the northern edge of Lake Forest, behind iron gates and old money arrogance. Every inch of the mansion screamed generational wealth, crystal chandeliers, imported marble. oil paintings of dead relatives who all looked emotionally unavailable. Evelyn Tucker greeted them first. Tall, elegant, sharp enough to cut glass. She kissed Jason's cheek immediately. "Aren't you exhausted, sweetheart? You work too hard." Then her eyes shifted toward Alice. Alice. No hug. No warmth. Just acknowledgement. Richard Tucker appeared moments later holding a whiskey glass. "Jason," he said proudly, "Grant Whitmore called yesterday, said your expansion numbers are impressive." Jason smiled modestly. Alice felt sick because she had helped build those numbers. Jason had spent entire nights using her research and strategy suggestions while taking full credit publicly, but nobody at this table would ever know that. They moved into the dining room where candles flickered against polished silverware. Halfway through dinner, Evelyn began discussing the hospital foundation gala. "We're expanding donor outreach this year," she said. Jason mentioned Madison has been extremely helpful. Alice froze slightly. Jason didn't look at her. Evelyn continued smiling. "She's delightful." The word felt intentional. Alice set down her wine glass carefully. "I didn't realize you'd met her." A strange silence followed, tiny, but noticeable. Richard took another sip of whiskey. Jason adjusted his napkin. Then Evelyn smiled again. "Oh, she joined us for lunch last week. Such a refreshing young woman." Young woman. Alice suddenly understood. This wasn't accidental. They knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough. Enough to choose sides already. A tight ache spread across Alice's chest, and then as if the night hadn't humiliated her enough, the front door opened. Voices echoed faintly through the hallway. Jason's posture stiffened instantly. Seconds later, Madison Cole walked into the dining room wearing a cream-colored coat and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Alice felt the entire room tilt. Madison acted surprised. "Oh my God, I didn't realize dinner had already started." "Liar!" Evelyn stood immediately. "Madison, sweetheart, come in." "Sweetheart!" Alice looked at Jason slowly. He wouldn't meet her eyes. Madison removed her coat gracefully and handed it to a housekeeper before taking the empty chair beside Jason. Beside Jason, not across from him, not politely distant. Beside him. "This weather is awful," Madison said lightly. Downtown traffic was a nightmare. Downtown. Near the penthouse. Alice felt nausea climb into her throat. The rest of dinner unfolded like psychological torture. Madison laughed too easily at Jason's jokes. Richard asked her opinions about business strategy. Evelyn complimented her intelligence repeatedly. And Jason looked comfortable in a way he hadn't looked with Alice in years. At one point, Madison touched Jason's wrist while speaking. Tiny gesture, intimate gesture, automatic gesture. Alice noticed Jason didn't pull away. Nobody else reacted, which meant this had happened before. More than once. Alice suddenly realized she had been the last person to understand her own marriage was ending. "How's the foundation work going?" Alice Madison asked sweetly. Alice looked up. "Fine." Madison smiled sympathetically. "That must be fulfilling." The tone carried something underneath it. Pity. Like Alice was a volunteer while real power belonged to people like Jason and Madison. Alice swallowed hard. "I enjoy meaningful work." Madison tilted her head. "That's important, especially when someone's husband is building such a major career." There it was, not even subtle anymore. Jason finally spoke. "Madison." A warning. But not because he respected Alice, because Madison was getting reckless. Alice saw it clearly now. The affair wasn't hidden anymore, it was becoming public in private circles, and they expected her to tolerate it quietly. For appearances, for status, for Jason. After dinner, Alice escaped onto the back terrace, overlooking the frozen lake. Cold air sliced against her skin. A few minutes later, heels clicked behind her. Madison again. "Of course." "You're stronger than I expected," Madison said softly. Alice didn't turn around. "What do you want from me?" Madison stepped beside her. "I think you already know." Alice finally looked at her. Madison's expression held no guilt, only confidence, possession. "He doesn't love you anymore," Madison said quietly. The words should have shattered Alice. Instead, something inside her became terrifyingly calm. Because for the first time, Alice stopped seeing Madison as the problem. Madison wasn't the disease. Jason was. And suddenly, Alice understood something dangerous. If Jason was willing to destroy her quietly, then maybe she needed to stop protecting him publicly. Alice barely remembered driving home from the Tucker estate that night. The world outside the windshield blurred into streaks of white headlights and freezing rain while Madison's voice echoed relentlessly in her mind. He doesn't love you anymore. What terrified Alice most wasn't the possibility that it was true. It was the realization that Jason no longer cared whether she knew. There had once been guilt in him, carefulness. Now there was arrogance, the kind that came from believing someone would never leave no matter how badly they were treated. When they reached home, Jason loosened his tie and walked inside without saying a word. Alice remained in the garage for several seconds, staring blankly ahead. Then she noticed her hands. They were shaking violently, not from sadness, from rage. 12 years. 12 years of loyalty reduced to humiliation at a dinner table while another woman sat beside her husband like a replacement, already approved by the family. Alice entered the house slowly. Jason was pouring himself bourbon in the kitchen. He looked calm, relaxed, like the evening had been completely normal. That almost broke her. "You invited her there," Alice said quietly. Jason took a sip before answering. She was stopping by to discuss business. Alice laughed softly. The sound frightened even her. "Do you hear yourself anymore?" Jason sighed heavily. "I'm not doing this tonight." "No," Alice snapped suddenly. "You don't get to keep saying that." Jason turned toward her. Something cold entered his expression. "You're becoming exhausting." The sentence landed harder than screaming would have. Alice stared at him, exhausting. That was what he called the woman who built his life. The woman who defended him, supported him, sacrificed for him. Jason rubbed his forehead impatiently. "I don't know what you want from me. The truth, the apology, the respect." But suddenly Alice realized something devastating. He wasn't capable of giving her any of those things anymore. "You embarrassed me in front of your family," she whispered. Jason's jaw tightened. "My family is tired of your dramatics too." Alice physically recoiled. There it was. Confirmation. Not only had they accepted Madison, they had turned Alice into the problem. Jason stepped closer, lowering his voice like he was speaking to a difficult child. "You need to calm down before you destroy everything over paranoia." Alice looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time in 12 years, she saw absolutely no remorse. Only irritation, only inconvenience, only a man desperate to avoid consequences. Something inside her died quietly then, not loudly, not theatrically, just a soft internal collapse. Jason checked his phone. Madison's name lit briefly across the screen before disappearing. He angled it away instinctively. Too late, Alice noticed. Jason noticed her noticing. But instead of guilt, he looked annoyed again. "I'm going to bed," he muttered. Alice nodded slowly. "Okay." Jason paused slightly, almost confused by her calmness. Normally she would cry, argue, try to save things. Tonight she simply turned away, and somehow that unsettled him more. After Jason disappeared upstairs, Alice stood alone in the kitchen for several minutes. The silence felt enormous. Then she walked to the wine cabinet, poured herself a glass, and carried it upstairs toward Jason's home office. Their home office, technically. Though over the years it had become another room Jason occupied, while Alice quietly supported him from the background. She opened the door and stepped inside. Mahogany shelves, luxury desk, awards covering the walls, most with Jason's name engraved on them. Alice stared at the plaques bitterly. How many speeches had she written for him? How many late nights had she spent editing presentations while Jason slept peacefully beside her afterward? She moved toward the desk slowly. Something had shifted inside her tonight. The desperate wife begging for honesty was disappearing. In her place stood someone colder, someone observant, someone finally willing to see reality clearly. Alice opened one drawer after another, mostly harmless paperwork, contracts, meeting notes, expense reports. Then she found an older laptop buried beneath folders, Jason's previous work computer. She frowned slightly. He almost never kept outdated electronics. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. Alice pressed the power button. The laptop flickered to life slowly. Password protected. Of course. Alice stared at the screen for several seconds, then typed Madison. Incorrect password. Her chest tightened. She tried another. Chicago 2022. Incorrect. Then suddenly she remembered. Their anniversary, June 14th. The screen unlocked. Alice physically stopped breathing. because that told her everything. Jason still used their anniversary as the password protecting the life he built while betraying her. Cruel, lazy, pathetic. Alice opened the email archive first. Hundreds. There were hundreds. Hotel confirmations, private flights, deleted message backups, photos, God the photos, Jason and Madison in restaurants, Jason and Madison in the penthouse, Madison wearing Alice's favorite silk robe in one image. Alice shut the laptop instantly. Nausea slammed into her throat. She stumbled toward the bathroom and barely made it before vomiting. Her entire body trembled violently afterward, not because she still doubted him, but because betrayal became unbearable once it transformed from suspicion into evidence. Alice sat on the bathroom floor for a long time trying to breathe. Then slowly she stood back up and returned to the office. No more denial, no more protecting herself from the truth. If Jason wanted destruction, then Alice would finally look directly at it. She reopened the laptop. This time she forced herself through everything carefully. Madison's messages were full of arrogance. She mocked Alice openly, called her pathetic, old-fashioned, too weak to leave. One message made Alice's blood run cold. She still thinks you feel guilty. That's honestly embarrassing. Jason's response came 3 minutes later. I stopped feeling guilty a long time ago. Alice stared at the sentence until her vision blurred. That line hurt more than the affair itself, because it meant Jason had watched her suffering and simply stopped caring. Then Alice found something worse. Financial files, corporate transfer records, charity allocations connected to the hospital foundation, and her name. Alice frowned immediately. Why was her name attached to these documents? She opened another file, then another. A chill spread through her body. Jason had used Alice's nonprofit credentials and foundation access during several questionable financial approvals. Not illegal at first glance, but unethical enough to destroy careers if investigated properly. Conflict of interest, hidden consulting payments, foundation money routed through shell vendors connected to Madison. Alice's pulse accelerated. Jason hadn't just betrayed her emotionally. He had exposed her professionally, without her knowledge. Alice leaned back slowly in the chair. The room suddenly felt very quiet, very still. Then something terrifying happened. Alice stopped crying. Completely. The grief remained, but it hardened, condensed into something sharper, more dangerous, because Jason thought she was weak, predictable, too emotional to act rationally. He still believed she would beg him to love her again. Alice stared at the glowing laptop screen for a long moment. Then she opened a blank email draft. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. Outside, snow began falling softly across the dark Chicago suburbs. Upstairs, Jason Tucker slept peacefully in the house Alice helped build, completely unaware that downstairs, his wife had finally stopped trying to save the marriage and started preparing to survive it. Alice did not sleep. By 4 a.m, the wine glass beside her laptop sat untouched and warm, while dozens of files glowed across the screen in icy blue light. Every document she opened made the betrayal uglier. Jason hadn't simply been reckless, he had been systematic, careful, confident. The consulting payments routed through Madison's shell company were disguised as healthcare outreach initiatives. Expense reports had been altered. Approval signatures connected to Alice's nonprofit credentials appeared repeatedly in transactions she had never seen before. Jason had used her reputation like a shield. If everything collapsed, her name would collapse beside his. Alice leaned back slowly in the leather office chair. For years, she had thought the worst thing Jason could do was stop loving her. Now she realized love had disappeared long ago. What remained was exploitation. The clock on the desk read 4:17 a.m. Alice stared at her phone for a long moment before finally scrolling to Naomi Bennett's contact. They hadn't spoken properly in months. Life had gotten busy. Or rather, Alice's marriage had consumed her so completely that she stopped nurturing the people who actually loved her. Naomi answered on the third ring voice, thick with sleep. Alice. Alice almost broke down hearing genuine concern. Not annoyance, not irritation. Concern. I need help. Silence. Then Naomi's tone sharpened instantly. What happened? Alice looked at the glowing laptop screen. My husband made a mistake. 20 minutes later, Naomi sat across from her kitchen island, wearing a camel coat over silk pajamas, dark curls tied messily above exhausted eyes. Naomi Bennett had always looked intimidatingly composed. Even at 39, she carried the energy of someone who dismantled powerful men for a living because she literally did. Corporate litigation, financial misconduct, high-profile divorces. Naomi built a reputation turning wealthy executives into cautionary tales. Now she studied the files spread across Alice's dining table with frightening focus. "How long have you known?" Naomi asked quietly. About the affair, Alice folded her arms tightly. "A while." Naomi looked up, and the financial fraud Alice swallowed. Tonight, the kitchen fell silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Naomi opened another document carefully. "This is bad." Alice laughed weakly. "That's an understatement." "No," Naomi said seriously. "Alice, listen to me carefully. This isn't just infidelity. Jason exposed you legally." A cold ache spread through Alice's chest again. Naomi continued scanning paperwork. "He used your nonprofit access credentials to authorize transfers connected to Madison's consulting contracts. I never approved any of those. I know that." Naomi's expression darkened, but proving intent matters. Alice sat slowly across from her. For the first time all night, fear truly settled in. Not heartbreak, not humiliation. Fear. Jason could destroy her professionally. Naomi closed one folder sharply. "What else did you find?" Alice hesitated, then opened the hidden photo archive. Naomi's jaw tightened visibly as image after image appeared. Jason kissing Madison in the penthouse kitchen. Jason in hotel suites. Madison wearing Alice's bracelet in one picture. "Oh my God," Naomi whispered. Alice stared numbly at the screen. "I think the affair would hurt less if he hadn't enjoyed humiliating me." Naomi reached across the table immediately and squeezed her hand. "Alice." That single moment of kindness almost shattered her completely, because Jason hadn't touched her gently in months. Alice pulled herself together quickly. "What do I do?" Naomi became very still. Then she asked the question that changed everything. "What do you want?" Alice blinked. "I don't know." "Yes, you do." Naomi leaned closer. "Do you want revenge? Silence, divorce protection?" "Because those are different strategies." Alice looked down at the files again, at Madison's mocking messages, at Jason's financial manipulations, at the evidence proving he stopped viewing her as a person a long time ago. Then she whispered something that surprised even herself. "I want the truth to cost him something." Naomi held her gaze for several seconds, then slowly nodded. "Okay." The sun began rising over the Chicago skyline as they organized evidence. Naomi worked methodically, emails categorized, financial documents duplicated, timestamps preserved. Alice watched her friend operate with terrifying precision. "You were always smarter than him," Naomi muttered while reviewing spreadsheets. Alice frowned slightly. "What, Jason?" Naomi looked up briefly. "His entire career works because people like you clean up behind him." The statement hit harder than expected because it was true. Alice suddenly remembered every moment she minimized herself to make Jason shine brighter. Every introduction she arranged, every fundraiser she salvaged, every emotional burden she absorbed quietly while Jason climbed higher socially. And now he called her exhausting. Naomi closed the final folder. "Here's the reality. If this goes public internally, Horizon Healthcare will investigate immediately." Alice nodded slowly. "The board." "The board will panic," Naomi corrected, "especially Ethan Brooks." At the mention of Ethan's name, Alice looked up. Ethan Brooks sat on Horizon's executive board and chaired the Hospital Foundation Ethics Committee. Unlike most men in Jason's circle, Ethan had always respected Alice professionally. "He trusts you?" Naomi continued. "If evidence comes from you, they'll take it seriously." Alice stared out the kitchen windows where snow covered the backyard in soft white silence. "I never wanted to destroy his life." Naomi's expression softened for the first time all morning. "Alice, he already risked destroying yours." The truth settled heavily between them. By 9:30, Jason still hadn't come downstairs, probably sleeping peacefully after another night of betrayal. The arrogance of that made Alice physically cold. Naomi slid the laptop toward her. "You need to decide now." Alice looked at the blank email draft, still open on the screen. Subject line empty, cursor blinking patiently. Once sent, there would be no undoing it, no returning to denial, no pretending the marriage could still be saved quietly. Alice's chest tightened painfully because despite everything, part of her still loved him, or maybe she loved the version of Jason that no longer existed. Naomi seemed to read her thoughts. "You can still walk away silently," she said gently. Alice closed her eyes briefly. She imagined doing that, signing divorce papers quietly, protecting Jason publicly, letting Madison move freely through the life Alice built, and years from now, Jason would still believe she was too weak to leave with dignity. No, something inside her rejected that completely. Alice opened her eyes again, calm now, terrifyingly calm. Who needs to receive this? Naomi immediately began listing names. Horizon Legal Department, Ethan Brooks, Internal Compliance, Hospital Foundation Oversight. Alice nodded slowly. Then she began typing, every word precise, professional, emotionless, no screaming accusations, no emotional breakdown, only facts, documented concerns regarding financial irregularities and undisclosed conflicts of interest connected to Horizon Healthcare consulting operations. Naomi watched carefully. "Good," she murmured. "Keep it clinical." Alice attached the evidence files one by one. Emails, transfers, contracts, approval records, photographs. By the end, the message looked devastating. Not because it sounded angry, because it sounded credible. Alice hovered over the send button. Her pulse thundered violently. This was the moment, the exact second her old life would begin collapsing. Naomi placed a hand over hers gently. "You ready, Alice?" Thought about Madison's smile. Jason's lies, Evelyn calling Madison refreshing, 12 years of shrinking herself for people who never truly valued her. Then she pressed send. The email disappeared instantly, gone, released into the world like a lit match, thrown into gasoline. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Then Naomi exhaled softly. "Well," she said quietly, "that's going to ruin somebody's morning." Upstairs, Alice heard movement. Jason waking up. Completely unaware that downstairs, his wife had just started a war he would never see coming. Jason Tucker realized something was wrong the moment Alice stopped reacting. Not yelling, not crying, not asking questions. Silence terrified guilty people more than rage ever could. On the morning after Alice sent the email, she moved through the kitchen with unsettling calmness. Coffee brewed quietly, toast warmed in the oven. Snow drifted softly outside the windows, while Jason stood near the counter watching her carefully. "You're up early," he said. Alice handed him a cup of coffee without looking at him. "So are you." Jason frowned slightly. Normally after fights, Alice looked emotionally exhausted. Today she looked composed, beautiful even. That disturbed him. He studied her while loosening his tie. "Where's Naomi?" Alice took a slow sip of coffee. "She left an hour ago." Jason's expression sharpened instantly. Naomi Bennett was here. Alice finally looked at him. "Yes. What for?" The question came too quickly, too sharply. Alice almost smiled, because there it was, fear, tiny, hidden, but real. "She's my friend," Alice replied calmly. "Do I need permission to see her too?" Jason leaned against the counter carefully. "What did you tell her?" Alice buttered toast with perfect precision. "The truth." Jason's jaw flexed. "And what exactly is the truth these days?" Alice met his eyes directly. "That depends. Do you want the version you tell people, or the real one?" For a brief second, tension crackled violently between them. Jason looked away first. That had never happened before. His phone buzzed suddenly across the marble countertop. He glanced down. Unknown number. Jason answered immediately. "Yes, silence." Then Alice watched his entire posture change. Subtle at first, then immediate. Rigid shoulders, sharp breathing, eyes darkening. "Who authorized this?" Jason demanded quietly. Alice continued eating breakfast, completely calm. Jason turned away from her instinctively. "No, don't suspend anything yet," he snapped into the phone. "I'll handle it." He ended the call aggressively, then stared at Alice. "What did you do?" Alice folded her napkin neatly. "What makes you think I did something?" Jason stepped closer. "The legal department flagged consulting accounts this morning." Alice tilted her head slightly. "Really?" "You talked to somebody. I talked to lots of people. Jason's voice dropped dangerously low. Alice. Normally, that tone intimidated her. Not anymore. Because fear only controls people who still believe they deserve mistreatment. Alice stood calmly. You should get to work, she said softly. Sounds like you're having a stressful morning. Jason stared at her with growing suspicion, and for the first time in years, Alice enjoyed watching him feel uncertain. At Horizon Healthcare headquarters, panic moved quietly beneath polished corporate smiles. Alice arrived shortly after noon for a donor strategy meeting. The moment she stepped into the building, she felt it. The shift. People looked nervous. Assistants whispered behind desks. Executives moved faster than usual through hallways. Somebody from internal compliance stood outside a conference room speaking urgently into a phone. Alice walked toward her office with controlled calmness. Sophie Miller nearly collided with her near the elevators. Oh my God, Sophie whispered. What the hell is happening upstairs? Alice blinked innocently. What do you mean? Sophie glanced around carefully before lowering her voice. Internal auditors arrived this morning. They're reviewing consulting contracts and foundation accounts. Alice maintained a neutral expression. Maybe somebody filed a complaint. Sophie stared at her for a long moment, then slowly asked, Did you? Alice picked up a folder from her desk. I have a meeting in 10 minutes. That wasn't an answer, but Sophie suddenly understood anyway. Her eyes widened slightly. Alice. I'm okay, Alice interrupted quietly. And strangely enough, it was true. Not fully okay. Not healed, but no longer drowning. Because pain became easier to survive once it transformed into clarity. Across the building, Jason's world was beginning to crack. By mid-afternoon, he had already attended 2 emergency meetings. Compliance wanted documentation, legal wanted explanations, and Ethan Brooks personally requested a review of every consulting payment connected to Madison Cole. Jason sat inside his office pretending calmness while rage burned beneath his skin. Somebody betrayed him. No, not somebody. Alice. It had to be Alice. His phone buzzed again. Madison. Jason answered immediately. Don't call me repeatedly. Madison sounded furious. They froze my access to the expansion accounts. Jason closed his eyes briefly. Keep your voice down. What is happening? Jason lowered his tone. Internal review. Probably routine. Routine, Madison hissed. Jason, they escorted accounting staff out of meetings this morning. Jason stood abruptly and closed his office blinds. I said I'll handle it. Madison's breathing sharpened through the line. This is your wife, isn't it? Jason didn't answer immediately, and that silence told Madison everything. Oh my God, she doesn't know enough to hurt us, Jason muttered. Even as he said it, he realized he no longer believed it, because Alice had changed. Something about her calmness this morning unsettled him deeply. She wasn't emotional anymore. She was controlled, and controlled women were dangerous, especially women who spent years quietly observing everything. Meanwhile, Alice sat through her donor meeting with frightening composure. Dr. Caroline Hayes discussed women's healthcare initiatives while Alice took notes normally. But beneath the surface, Alice felt oddly detached from her own life, like she was watching the destruction from outside her body. At one point, Caroline paused. You seem different today. Alice looked up carefully. In a bad way. No, Caroline said slowly. Stronger. The word startled her. Stronger. Alice had spent years believing endurance was strength. Now she wondered if strength actually meant finally refusing humiliation. After the meeting ended, Alice walked toward the executive corridor. That was when she saw Madison. For the first time, Madison didn't look confident. 2 men from corporate compliance stood beside her near reception. One held a folder, the other spoke quietly while Madison's face drained of color. Alice slowed instinctively. Madison looked up, their eyes met across the lobby, and suddenly Madison understood. Alice saw it happen in real time. The realization, the panic, the horror. Alice did this. Madison marched toward her immediately in furious heels. What did you say? She demanded. Several employees looked up instantly. Alice remained calm. I'm not sure what you mean. Don't do that, Madison snapped. Don't stand there pretending innocence. Alice studied her quietly. Interesting. Madison suddenly looked younger, less polished. Fear stripped glamour away quickly. You should lower your voice, Alice said softly. People are watching. Madison's eyes burned with hatred. You vindictive bitch. Alice barely reacted, because strangely, the insult no longer hurt. Madison stepped closer. You think Jason loves you now? After this, Alice looked at her calmly. This was never about getting him back. That answer visibly shook Madison. Before she could respond, one of the compliance officers approached carefully. Ms. Cole, he said professionally, we need your building access card. The entire lobby fell silent. Madison froze. What? Your access credentials have been temporarily suspended pending investigation. Humiliation flooded across Madison's face instantly. No, there's obviously some misunderstanding. The officer remained polite. Please surrender your badge. Alice watched the scene without emotion. Not satisfaction, not joy, just clarity. Because this wasn't revenge anymore. It was consequence. Madison turned toward Jason's office hallway desperately, but Jason never appeared, and somehow, that was the cruelest part. The compliance officer extended his hand again. Madison's fingers trembled as she removed her badge. Then security arrived. Actual security. Gasps echoed softly throughout the lobby. Madison looked at Alice one final time. Hatred, shock, humiliation. But underneath all of it, fear. Because Madison finally realized something too late, Alice Tucker had never been weak. Only patient. And patient women became terrifying once they stopped protecting the people who hurt them. By Friday morning, everyone in Chicago's upper corporate circle knew something was wrong at Horizon Healthcare. Not officially, not publicly, but wealthy people sensed scandal the way sharks sensed blood. Meetings were suddenly canceled, phone calls went unanswered, executives avoided eye contact in elevators, and Madison Cole, once welcomed into every luxury networking dinner in the city, had vanished from the building entirely. Alice watched the fallout quietly. That was the strangest part of all this. She had imagined revenge would feel dramatic, triumphant. Instead, it felt cold. Still, like watching a storm roll across a lake from behind thick glass, she sat in her office reviewing donor reports when Sophie entered without knocking. You need to see this. Alice looked up slowly. Sophie held her phone out. A private industry blog headline filled the screen. Horizon Healthcare under internal ethics review. Following consultant payment irregularities. No names yet. But the comments underneath already speculated wildly. Madison's name appeared repeatedly. So did Jason's. Alice handed the phone back calmly. Sophie stared at her. You're terrifying right now. Alice almost smiled. I spent years being underestimated. Maybe this is healthier. Sophie hesitated. Do you feel bad? The question lingered between them longer than expected. Alice looked down at the paperwork in front of her. Did she maybe for the version of Jason she once loved, but not for the man he became? No, Alice answered honestly, and that truth shocked even her. Meanwhile, Jason's life was beginning to collapse in real time. He spent most of Friday trapped in conference rooms with attorneys and compliance officers, while rumors spread faster than he could contain them. Grant Whitmore, Horizon's CEO, had stopped returning his calls directly. Ethan Brooks requested full financial disclosure reports. Internal auditors continued reviewing consulting contracts connected to Madison. And worst of all, Jason still didn't fully understand how much Alice knew. That uncertainty was destroying him. By late afternoon, his assistant informed him another payment account tied to Madison's consulting firm had been frozen. Jason slammed his office door hard enough to shake the walls, then immediately called Madison. She answered crying. They canceled my contract. Jason shut his eyes tightly. Calm down. Calm down, Madison snapped through tears. My apartment access was revoked this morning. The penthouse. Of course. The lease had been connected through corporate reimbursement channels. Once compliance froze associated accounts, management likely locked everything immediately. Jason rubbed his forehead violently. I'll fix it. You said your wife was weak. The accusation cut sharper than Jason expected. She is not weak, he muttered before he could stop himself. Silence followed. Then Madison laughed bitterly. Well, apparently you married a psychopath. Jason ended the call without answering. Because deep down, he was starting to realize he had no idea who Alice Tucker truly was anymore. That evening, Alice drove home through downtown Chicago beneath falling snow. The city lights reflected across wet streets in blurred gold and silver, while soft music played quietly through the speakers. For the first time in months, her chest didn't feel heavy, not healed, not happy, but lighter, like she could finally breathe again. When she entered the house, silence greeted her immediately. Jason wasn't home yet. Alice removed her coat slowly and walked into the kitchen. Then she noticed it, a stack of papers neatly arranged on the marble island. Legal documents, bank records, property statements. Jason had been gathering information, preparing, interesting. Alice opened the refrigerator calmly and poured herself sparkling water. Her phone buzzed. Naomi, how's the apocalypse? Alice leaned against the counter. Quiet. That means it's working. Alice stared out the dark kitchen windows. I thought I'd feel guiltier. Naomi's voice softened. Women like you usually do, because you spent years prioritizing everyone else's comfort over your own survival. Alice swallowed hard. The truth of that hurt. I ignored so much. No, Naomi corrected gently. You trusted someone who trained you to doubt yourself. Alice closed her eyes briefly. Jason had spent years making her feel irrational for noticing obvious disrespect. By the time Madison appeared openly, Alice had already been conditioned to apologize for her instincts. Naomi spoke again. You need to protect yourself now, emotionally and financially. Alice looked toward the hallway leading upstairs. I know. You prepared the account transfers? Yes. Good. Earlier that afternoon, under Naomi's guidance, Alice quietly secured her personal assets and froze several shared discretionary accounts linked to Jason's spending. Not vindictive, strategic, because wealthy men often became cruelest when losing control. Naomi paused. How's Jason acting? Alice let out a humorless laugh. Confused, angry, scared. Good. Alice frowned slightly. You sound happy about that. I am, Naomi said bluntly. Men like Jason only respect consequences. The garage door suddenly rumbled open downstairs. Jason was home. Alice's heartbeat slowed strangely instead of accelerating. Naomi heard the sound through the phone. That him, yes. Call me later if you need me. Alice ended the call softly just as Jason entered the kitchen. He looked terrible. Not physically destroyed, but shaken. His expensive coat hung open carelessly, tie loosened unevenly, eyes dark with exhaustion. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Jason noticed the organized paperwork on the island. His expression changed immediately. What is this? Alice took another sip of water calmly. Financial separation documents. Jason stared at her. You froze the joint accounts, the discretionary ones. You had no right. I had every right. The interruption startled him. Alice almost never interrupted people, especially Jason. He stepped closer aggressively. Do you understand what kind of damage you've caused this week? Alice looked at him carefully. You mean professionally? Jason laughed once in disbelief. You think this is funny? No, Alice said quietly. I think it's overdue. Jason's face hardened. You went behind my back. You involved the board, legal departments, compliance. You involved another woman in our marriage. That's personal, he snapped. Alice stared at him in genuine disbelief. Personal? As if fraud, misuse of nonprofit funds and exploiting her credentials were private marital issues. You used my name on financial approvals. Jason froze slightly. That reaction told her everything. You didn't know about those, he said carefully. Alice almost smiled. There it was again, the arrogance. He truly believed she'd never looked closely enough. Jason ran a hand through his hair. Alice, listen to me carefully. If this investigation escalates, it hurts both of us. No, she corrected softly. It hurts you. You're connected to the foundation too. And unlike you, Alice replied calmly, I didn't commit misconduct. Jason stared at her like he no longer recognized her. Maybe he didn't, because the old Alice would have been crying by now, begging him to reassure her, trying to save the marriage at the cost of herself. That woman was disappearing. Jason lowered his voice suddenly. What do you want? The question lingered heavily in the kitchen. Alice thought about it carefully. An apology. Too late, the marriage back impossible, justice maybe. But deeper than that, she wanted dignity. The thing Jason slowly stripped from her over years of manipulation. I want peace, she said finally. Jason's expression twisted bitterly. You're destroying my life over peace. Alice met his eyes steadily. No, Jason. A pause. You destroyed your life the moment you stopped believing I would leave. The silence afterward felt enormous. Jason looked away first again, and Alice realized something powerful in that moment. For the first time in their marriage, he was afraid of her. Jason Tucker stopped sleeping after the investigation began. Alice noticed it immediately. The dark circles beneath his eyes, the constant pacing, the sudden bursts of irritation followed by unnatural calmness. For years, Jason had moved through life with the confidence of a man who believed consequences belonged to other people. Now he looked hunted, and strangely enough, Alice felt nothing watching him unravel. Not satisfaction, not pity, just distance. By Monday morning, the atmosphere inside the Tucker house had become unbearable. They moved around each other like strangers trapped inside a museum of their failed marriage. No touching, no warmth, only silence heavy enough to suffocate. Alice stood in the kitchen preparing tea when Jason entered, wearing a navy suit and exhaustion. He looked at her carefully before speaking. We need to talk. Alice kept pouring hot water into her mug. We've been talking for years. You just never listened. Jason exhaled sharply. This isn't funny anymore. Alice glanced at him calmly. Who's laughing? That answer irritated him instantly. Jason had always known how to control emotional conversations, but he didn't know how to fight someone who no longer needed his approval. He stepped closer. Legal questioned me for 3 hours Friday. Alice stirred her tea slowly. That sounds stressful. Jason stared at her in disbelief. You caused this. No, Alice corrected softly. I exposed it. His jaw tightened. There's a difference. Yes, she said quietly. One involves accountability. Jason looked away for a second before trying a different approach. Alice recognized it immediately. The softer voice, the wounded expression, manipulation wrapped in vulnerability. Alice. He rubbed his forehead tiredly. We're married. The sentence almost made her laugh, because suddenly marriage mattered again now that his career was bleeding. You should have remembered that before moving another woman into a penthouse. Jason's expression darkened. It wasn't serious. Alice stared at him. Not serious. 12 years destroyed for something not serious. The cruelty of men like Jason was astonishing sometimes. They minimized devastation simply because they weren't the ones bleeding from it. She meant nothing. Jason continued quickly. It was stress. Ego. A mistake. Alice lifted her eyes slowly. You gave her my wedding ring. Jason froze. For the first time in days, genuine shame flickered across his face. Brief, but real. Alice almost hated herself for noticing, because a part of her still wanted remorse from him, still wanted proof that she once mattered deeply. Jason stepped closer again. I know I hurt you. Hurt. Such a small word for what he'd done. You humiliated me publicly, Alice whispered. You let your family humiliate me too. Jason's frustration returned immediately. My parents had nothing to do with this. They welcomed her to dinner. That doesn't mean she sat beside you while your mother called her refreshing. Jason fell silent, because there was no defense for that. Alice watched him carefully. You know the worst part, she said quietly. I kept trying to save us while you were busy replacing me. Jason's face twisted painfully. I wasn't replacing you. The lie sounded weak even to him. Alice shook her head slowly. You already did. Jason suddenly grabbed the edge of the counter hard enough for his knuckles to whiten. You think this is easy for me, Alice blinked in disbelief. There it was again. Him, always him, his stress, his pressure, his pain. Men like Jason consumed women emotionally until the women forgot they were allowed to hurt too. Alice picked up her tea calmly. I don't care if this is easy for you anymore. The sentence visibly hit him, because Alice had always cared before. Always. Jason followed her into the living room desperately. Can we stop acting like enemies for 5 minutes? Alice turned toward him slowly. You made me your enemy the moment you decided my loyalty made me disposable. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Jason's voice lowered. What do you want me to do finally? Not defensive, not arrogant, just desperate. Alice studied him carefully. The man she once loved more than herself now looked frightened and exhausted in the middle of the luxury home she helped build, but fear didn't erase what he'd done. I want honesty, she said softly. Jason nodded quickly. Fine. Why her? The question lingered painfully between them. Jason looked away immediately. That's complicated. No, Alice replied quietly. It's actually very simple. Jason rubbed his jaw. She made me feel... He hesitated. Younger, important, admired. Alice felt something inside her crack again. Not because of Madison, because Jason had chosen admiration over loyalty, attention over love. You know what's funny, Alice whispered. I spent years admiring you. Jason looked up sharply, and for one brief moment, he looked devastated. Good, he should, but then his expression hardened again, because shame rarely lasts long inside entitled people. You're not innocent in this marriage either, he muttered. Alice stared at him. There it was. Blame. Right on schedule. Jason stood straighter. You checked out years ago, too. Alice almost laughed. I checked out. You stopped trying, he snapped. Everything became routine, predictable. The audacity of it physically stunned her. Alice stepped closer slowly. I stopped trying because I was carrying both of us. Jason's breathing sharpened. You always make yourself the victim. No, Alice said calmly. I just finally stopped protecting the villain. That landed. Hard. Jason looked furious now. Good. Let him feel something uncomfortable for once. You think you're morally superior, he demanded. You just destroyed both our lives because your feelings got hurt. Alice stared at him carefully, then very quietly said, You still think this is about my feelings. Jason opened his mouth. Alice interrupted him immediately. You committed financial misconduct using my name. Jason froze. Again. Fear returned instantly. Real fear this time. Alice continued calmly. You exposed my professional reputation without my consent. You involved me in fraudulent approvals. You lied repeatedly. You manipulated me emotionally for years while publicly humiliating me with another woman. Her voice never rose once. That terrified Jason more than screaming ever could. And somehow she finished softly, You still believe you're the victim. Jason looked genuinely shaken now. Because for the first time, Alice was speaking with clarity instead of emotion. And clarity was impossible to gaslight. His phone buzzed suddenly. Unknown number again. Probably legal. Probably compliance. Probably another disaster. Jason ignored it. Instead, he looked at Alice with something close to panic. What happens now? Alice walked toward the hallway table slowly, then picked up a folder. Jason frowned. What's that? Divorce papers. The air left the room completely. Jason stared at the folder like it physically wounded him. You already filed? Naomi prepared everything. Jason's face darkened instantly at Naomi's name. Of course she did. Alice handed him the documents. He didn't take them immediately. Alice! For the first time in days, his voice sounded genuinely afraid. You're really leaving me. Not angry, not manipulative, just stunned. Because men like Jason never believed loyal women would actually walk away. Alice looked directly into his eyes. I already left, she whispered. My body just stayed longer than my heart did. Jason finally took the papers with trembling hands. Alice noticed it immediately. He was shaking, not from rage, from loss. And somehow, that still hurt her. Because despite everything, part of Alice mourned the man Jason could have been. But grief no longer meant surrender. Jason flipped through the paperwork quickly, then suddenly looked up sharply. You moved assets. Yes. You protected the foundation shares. Alice met his eyes calmly. Another silence. Then Jason realized something horrifying. Alice hadn't just survived his betrayal. She had outmaneuvered him. And for the first time since this began, Jason Tucker understood he was no longer dealing with the woman he thought he controlled. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. By 8:15, Horizon Healthcare headquarters already felt like the scene of a controlled disaster. Assistants whispered nervously near elevators. Legal teams moved quickly through corridors carrying thick folders. Executives avoided journalists gathering outside the building entrance. And somewhere beneath all the expensive calmness of corporate America, Jason Tucker's career was dying. Alice stood inside the executive restroom staring at her reflection. Black tailored suit, simple gold earrings, hair pulled back neatly. She looked composed, too composed for a woman whose marriage had imploded publicly in less than 2 weeks. But pain changed people, especially women who finally stopped begging to be chosen. Sophie entered quietly behind her. "You okay?" Alice met her eyes in the mirror. "I think so." Sophie stepped closer carefully. "Everybody's talking. I assume they would." "No," Sophie whispered. "I mean, everybody." Alice looked down briefly. Affairs usually embarrassed women more than men in their social circles. That was the ugly truth. Women got pitied, men got forgiven, but this situation had evolved beyond infidelity now. Financial misconduct frightened rich people more than broken vows ever could. Sophie hesitated. "Do you regret it?" Alice thought carefully before answering. "I regret trusting someone who mistook loyalty for weakness." Sophie nodded slowly. Then the intercom overhead announced the executive board session would begin in 10 minutes. The air inside the building tightened instantly. Alice exhaled slowly. It was time. The Horizon Executive Boardroom overlooked downtown Chicago through massive glass windows stretching floor to ceiling. Normally, the room represented power. Today, it felt like a courtroom. Grant Whitmore sat at the head of the table reviewing documents silently. Ethan Brooks stood near the windows, speaking quietly, with Horizon's chief legal officer. Several board members avoided eye contact entirely when Jason entered. Alice noticed that immediately. Corporate loyalty disappeared fast once liability entered the room. Jason looked exhausted. His expensive suit remained immaculate, but nothing else about him did. 3 sleepless nights had hollowed his face. He glanced toward Alice briefly when he entered. Something passed through his expression. Anger, regret, fear. Maybe all 3. Alice looked away first, not because she felt weak, because she was tired of emotionally carrying a man who only valued her once he started losing everything. Grant finally cleared his throat. "Let's begin." The room fell silent instantly. The legal officer opened the investigation summary carefully. Over the last 6 business days, Horizon Healthcare compliance teams have reviewed consultant payment activity connected to Ms. Madison Cole and related foundation partnerships. Jason folded his hands tightly together. Alice noticed the tension in his jaw immediately. Ethan Brooks spoke next. "We also reviewed authorization chains connected to nonprofit healthcare outreach funds." Then he looked directly at Jason. Several approvals appear intentionally concealed. The room became dangerously quiet. Jason finally spoke. "There's context missing here." Grant Whitmore's expression remained cold. "Then provide it." Jason straightened slightly. Madison Cole was hired to assist with strategic donor expansion initiatives. "Using shell vendor structures?" Ethan asked calmly. Jason's voice tightened. The vendor routing was temporary. The legal officer slid another document forward. "And the unauthorized use of foundation credentials tied to Alice Tucker." Alice felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Jason hesitated. That hesitation was fatal, because innocent people answered immediately. Alice was aware of outreach discussions, Jason said carefully. Alice almost laughed. Still lying, even now. Ethan turned toward her directly. "Mrs. Tucker, were you aware your credentials were attached to these approvals?" The entire room waited. Alice folded her hands calmly on the table. "No. One word, clear, steady, true." Jason closed his eyes briefly. Grant Whitmore leaned back heavily in his chair. "Jesus Christ, Jason." The disappointment in his voice hit harder than anger would have. Jason immediately looked toward Alice. This escalated because private marital issues were weaponized emotionally. The statement shocked the room. Alice stared at him in disbelief. Even now. He was trying to reduce everything to a woman being emotional. Grant's expression darkened instantly. "Are you seriously blaming your wife for your compliance violations?" Jason rubbed his forehead aggressively. "I'm saying this situation became personal." "No," Ethan interrupted quietly. "It became unethical." Silence crashed across the room. Then Ethan opened another folder. "What concerns me most is this pattern." He slid documents across the table. Alice recognized them instantly. Old proposal drafts, strategic healthcare expansion plans, women's donor initiative frameworks, all her work. Jason visibly stiffened. Grant frowned. "What exactly am I looking at?" Ethan answered carefully. "These are archived proposal drafts originally authored by Alice Tucker." The room shifted again. Alice felt heat crawl slowly up her neck. She never wanted this part exposed publicly. not because she felt ashamed, because she had spent years diminishing herself willingly to protect Jason's ego. Ethan continued. The successful expansion strategy Jason Tucker received executive recognition for last year appears substantially derived from Mrs. Tucker's unpublished foundation work. Grant looked sharply at Jason. You told us you built that proposal internally. Jason's silence answered everything. Alice looked down briefly. The humiliation hit differently now. Not painful, just clarifying. She had spent years making herself smaller so Jason could feel larger, and he took from her so naturally that eventually he stopped even noticing he was doing it. Grant stood slowly from his chair. I defended you repeatedly this week. Jason looked up immediately. Grant, you assured me this investigation would clear quickly. Jason's voice sharpened desperately. This is still manageable. No, Grant replied coldly. It isn't. The room fell silent again. Outside the windows, snow drifted softly across the Chicago skyline. Inside, Jason Tucker's carefully constructed life was collapsing piece by piece. Then Ethan spoke the sentence that finally shattered whatever remained. Effective immediately pending full legal review, Jason Tucker is suspended from executive operations at Horizon Healthcare. Silence. Pure silence. Jason stared at him like he'd been physically struck. You can't do that. We already did, Grant answered. Jason stood abruptly. This is insane. No one responded because everyone in the room understood the same thing now. Jason wasn't being punished for one mistake. He was finally facing the consequences of years spent believing he was untouchable. Jason looked toward Alice again. This time there was no anger left in his eyes, only panic, real panic, as if he finally understood how serious this had become. Alice, he said quietly. The sound of her name almost broke her heart anyway. That was the tragedy of loving someone deeply. Even after betrayal, some wounds still opened automatically. But Alice held herself steady, because loving someone no longer meant sacrificing herself for them. Jason stepped toward her slightly. You know I never wanted this. Alice looked at him for a long moment, then finally spoke. No, she said softly. You just never thought your actions would lead here. That truth devastated him more than yelling ever could. Grant motioned toward the door. Security will assist with credential surrender. Security. The word echoed brutally through the room. Jason Tucker, once one of the most admired executives in the company, was being escorted out like a liability. Jason looked around the boardroom desperately. No allies, no rescue, no Madison, no family, nobody. Because success built on manipulation collapses fast once people stop benefiting from it. 2 security officers appeared quietly near the entrance. Jason's face hardened instantly with humiliation. Alice watched him gather his things slowly. Then something unexpected happened. Jason looked at her one final time, and she saw genuine grief. Not for the investigation, not for the money, for her. Too late, but real. And somehow, that was the saddest part of all. 3 days after Jason's suspension, Evelyn Tucker invited Alice to lunch. Not because she cared. Alice understood that immediately. Women like Evelyn Tucker never reached out emotionally unless something valuable was at risk. And right now, the Tucker family name was bleeding publicly across every wealthy social circle in Chicago. The lunch took place at the same country club where Evelyn once hosted charity brunches and quietly evaluated women based on how well they elevated powerful men. Alice arrived exactly on time. Evelyn and Richard already sat near the window overlooking the frozen golf course. Expensive wine rested untouched beside them. Neither stood to greet her. Alice removed her coat slowly and sat across from them. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Evelyn sighed dramatically. You look tired. Alice almost smiled. Interesting. Not heartbroken, not betrayed. Tired, as though emotional devastation was simply poor posture. I've been through a lot recently, Alice replied calmly. Richard adjusted his cufflinks impatiently. Yes, well, we all have. There it was, the Tucker philosophy in one sentence. Pain only mattered when it affected them. A waiter approached briefly, but Alice declined a menu. I won't stay long, Evelyn folded her hands gracefully. That's probably best. We need to discuss something sensitive. Alice leaned back slightly. Of course they did. Evelyn's voice softened into practiced sophistication. The situation with Jason has become Embarrassing. Embarrassing. Alice stared at her in disbelief. Not devastating, not unethical, not cruel. Embarrassing. Richard finally spoke. The board investigation is attracting unnecessary attention. Alice blinked slowly. Unnecessary. Richard's expression hardened. You know exactly what I mean. No, actually, Alice didn't. Because somewhere between the affair, the fraud, and the public humiliation, she had stopped understanding how these people thought. Evelyn reached for her wineglass delicately. What's done is done. But dragging this further through legal channels helps no one. Alice laughed softly before she could stop herself. Both of them looked offended immediately. I'm sorry, Alice said quietly. I just realized none of you actually care what he did. Evelyn's face cooled instantly. That's unfair, is it? Alice looked directly at her. Your son cheated on me for months. He publicly humiliated me. He used my professional credentials illegally. And the only thing you're worried about is publicity. Richard leaned forward sharply. You need to understand how these things work. Alice stared at him. No, she replied softly. I think I finally do. Silence spread across the table. Then Evelyn made the mistake that changed everything. Men make mistakes, Alice. The sentence hit her like ice water. Not because it surprised her, because it confirmed every painful suspicion she'd been avoiding. They didn't see Jason as wrong. They saw him as entitled. Entitled to forgiveness, entitled to affairs, entitled to women cleaning up behind him forever. Alice slowly placed her napkin on the table. You welcomed Madison into your home. Evelyn sighed again impatiently. She was pleasant company. Alice physically recoiled at the cruelty hidden inside such a polished sentence. Pleasant company, that was what the woman sleeping with her son became. Meanwhile, Alice, the wife who sacrificed 12 years supporting Jason, became inconvenient. Richard lowered his voice. The longer this investigation continues, the more damage spreads to everyone connected. There it was. The real reason for the meeting. Fear. Not guilt. Fear. Alice looked at both of them carefully. For years, she tried desperately to earn their approval. Now she realized something devastating. They never intended to give it. Women like Evelyn only respected women who protected men at their own expense. Alice suddenly felt exhausted, not emotionally, spiritually, tired of shrinking herself around people who measured her value by her silence. You know, Alice said quietly, for years I blamed myself. Neither of them spoke. I thought maybe if I were more interesting, more successful, less emotional. Her throat tightened briefly. Maybe Jason would love me properly again. Evelyn looked uncomfortable now. Good, Alice continued. I kept trying harder while your son destroyed me slowly. Richard rubbed his forehead impatiently. This isn't productive. No, Alice agreed softly. What's unproductive is pretending Jason became this way alone. The air shifted instantly. Dangerous now. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Alice held her gaze steadily. It means you taught him women exist to absorb consequences for men. Richard's expression darkened immediately. That's enough. No, Alice said calmly. Actually, I'm done being quiet. Her own voice startled her slightly. Not loud, not emotional, just honest. And honesty terrified people who built entire lives around denial. Alice leaned forward slightly. You knew about Madison. Evelyn crossed her arms defensively. We suspected there were issues. You invited her to family dinners. She made Jason happy. The words landed like poison. Alice stared at Evelyn in complete disbelief. There it was. Finally. The truth stripped bare. Jason's happiness mattered more than Alice's dignity. Always had. Always would. Alice slowly nodded. Thank you. Evelyn frowned. For what? For finally being honest. Silence. Then Richard spoke carefully. You need to think strategically now. Alice almost smiled. I am. No, Richard corrected coldly. Emotionally, you're reacting. Alice looked directly into his eyes. You still think I did this because I'm emotional. Richard didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Alice reached into her bag calmly and removed several copied documents. Both of them stiffened instantly. What is this? Evelyn asked. Alice slid the papers across the table. Charity fund transfers. Private financial reallocations. Emergency business loans quietly tied to Tucker Family Holdings. Richard's face drained of color immediately. Interesting. So he recognized them. You used foundation money to stabilize your manufacturing losses. 3 years ago, Alice said softly. Evelyn looked horrified. Where did you get those? Alice ignored the question. You moved nonprofit allocations through secondary vendors connected to family trusts. Richard's voice lowered dangerously. You don't understand those documents. No, Alice replied calmly. I understand them perfectly. The silence afterward became suffocating, because suddenly the power dynamic had shifted completely. Evelyn looked genuinely shaken now. Alice, these records are confidential. So were Jason's affairs. Richard leaned closer aggressively. Are you threatening us? Alice considered the question carefully, then answered honestly. No, I'm telling you I finally understand this family. And she did. The Tucker family protected image above integrity, status above love, power above people. Jason hadn't become selfish accidentally. He was raised inside it. Evelyn's voice softened suddenly, manipulative again. Alice, sweetheart, we can still fix this. Sweetheart, now, after years of coldness, Alice almost pitied her. You don't want to fix this, Alice said gently. You want control back. Evelyn's face tightened. That's unfair. No, Alice whispered. It's accurate. Alice stood slowly and picked up her coat. Richard rose immediately. You walk out of here and things become much uglier. Alice paused, then looked at him with heartbreaking calmness. You should have worried about ugly when your son started destroying my life. Nobody spoke. Outside the giant country club windows, snow continued falling softly across the frozen landscape. Alice slipped her coat on slowly. Then she looked at Evelyn one final time. I loved Jason enough to destroy myself trying to save him. Her voice trembled slightly now, but I finally realized something. Evelyn stared silently. Alice smiled sadly. No woman should have to disappear for a man to feel powerful. Then she walked away. Not rushed, not emotional, just done. And as Alice Tucker stepped out into the cold Chicago afternoon, she realized something strange. For the first time in years, she no longer wanted the Tucker family to choose her. The apartment Alice rented downtown was less than half the size of the Tucker house. And somehow, it felt bigger. No marble staircase, no formal dining room, no cold silence stretching across empty luxury. Just sunlight, warm wood floors, a balcony overlooking the Chicago River, and peace. Real peace. The first night she slept there, Alice woke up confused because her chest didn't feel heavy. For 12 years, anxiety had become so normal, she stopped recognizing it. Now the absence of it felt unfamiliar. She sat up slowly in bed while pale winter sunlight filtered through sheer curtains. No Jason, no tension, no waiting for emotional scraps from a man who treated affection like a reward. Just quiet. Alice wrapped a blanket around herself and walked barefoot into the kitchen. The apartment still smelled new. Fresh paint, coffee, freedom. That thought startled her. Freedom. Not loneliness, not failure. Freedom. Her phone buzzed softly on the counter. Naomi. How's the glamorous divorced woman apartment? Alice smiled faintly. Smaller than I imagined. Smaller is easier to clean emotionally. Alice laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. A real laugh. Naomi immediately noticed. There she is. Alice leaned against the counter, holding her coffee. She who, the woman you used to be before Jason convinced you, survival was love. The sentence lingered painfully, because Alice didn't fully know who she was anymore outside the marriage. For years, every part of her identity revolved around supporting someone else. Jason's schedule, Jason's career, Jason's image. Now she had empty space. An empty space could either heal people or terrify them. I don't know what to do with myself yet, Alice admitted. Naomi's voice softened. You don't have to figure out forever right now. Just figure out today. Today. Alice could handle today. Later that afternoon, she attended her first therapy session. The office overlooked Lake Michigan through enormous windows, soft instrumental music filling the room gently. Dr. Elena Morris listened quietly while Alice explained the affair, the manipulation, the humiliation, the gaslighting. At one point, Alice stopped speaking suddenly. What Dr. Morris asked gently, Alice stared down at her hands. I think I'm angry at myself. Why? For staying. The confession came out raw. Painfully raw. Dr. Morris leaned forward slightly. Women don't stay because they're weak, Alice. A pause. They stay because they love deeply. Alice felt tears rise instantly. But eventually Dr. Morris continued softly, love without respect becomes self-abandonment. That sentence followed Alice for days afterward. Self-abandonment, not sacrifice, not loyalty, self-abandonment. For the first time she understood the difference. Over the next several weeks, Alice slowly rebuilt routines that belonged only to her. Morning walks by the river, Pilates classes, coffee shops where nobody knew her as Jason Tucker's wife. She reconnected with old friends she'd unintentionally neglected during the marriage. And slowly, piece by piece, Alice began returning to herself. One afternoon, while organizing bookshelves in the apartment, her phone rang unexpectedly. Dr. Caroline Hayes. Alice answered immediately. Hi, Caroline. Do you have time for lunch tomorrow? Alice frowned slightly. Sure. Caroline hesitated briefly. There's something I want to discuss professionally. Professionally. Alice hadn't heard that word connected to herself seriously in years. The restaurant Caroline chose overlooked downtown Chicago from the top floor of a luxury hotel. Alice arrived wearing a cream wool coat and simple black dress. When Caroline saw her, she smiled warmly. You look different. Alice sat carefully. Good different or concerning different, alive? Caroline answered honestly. The word hit unexpectedly hard. Alive, not surviving, not enduring, alive. After ordering lunch, Caroline got straight to the point. The Foundation Board wants to expand the Women's Healthcare Initiative next year. Alice nodded politely. That's great. We want you to lead it. Silence. Alice blinked slowly. I'm sorry. What? Caroline smiled faintly. You heard me. Alice stared at her in disbelief. Caroline. I haven't held a formal executive role in years. Because you sacrificed your career supporting someone else's? Direct, true, painful. Caroline continued calmly. I've watched you manage donor relationships, healthcare outreach, strategy, crisis, communications, and fundraising logistics for over a decade. Frankly, half the men running executive healthcare boards couldn't do what you do. Alice looked down immediately, overwhelmed. No one had spoken about her abilities like this in years. Not because she lacked talent, because she married a man who needed her smaller to feel larger. Caroline leaned forward slightly. Jason's collapse forced a lot of people to reevaluate who was actually holding things together. Alice swallowed hard. You really think I can do this? Caroline looked almost offended. Alice, I think you should have been doing it years ago. Something emotional cracked open inside her then. Not grief. Possibility. Meanwhile, Jason's world continued collapsing quietly. Rumors spread relentlessly through Chicago corporate circles. The investigation remained ongoing. Several business partnerships withdrew temporarily. Madison disappeared almost entirely from public view, and Jason drank more now. Alice heard about it indirectly through mutual contacts. Not dramatically, not recklessly, just enough to numb himself every night. One evening, Sophie stopped by Alice's apartment carrying takeout containers. You should see the way people talk about Jason now, she muttered, while unpacking food. Alice frowned slightly. I don't really care. I know. Sophie paused. That's what's weird. Alice looked up. Sophie studied her carefully. You loved that man like your entire life depended on him. A soft smile. And now you finally look free. The statement settled heavily in the room. Free. Alice still wasn't fully used to that word. Later that night, after Sophie left, Alice stood alone on her balcony overlooking the city. Snow drifted softly between skyscrapers, while headlights shimmered across wet streets below. Her phone buzzed unexpectedly. Unknown number. Alice almost ignored it, then answered. Silence. Then Jason's voice. I miss you. Her chest tightened automatically. Some reflexes didn't disappear overnight. Alice stayed quiet. Jason sounded exhausted. I know I don't deserve to call. No, Alice replied softly. You don't. A painful silence followed. I drove by the house today, Jason admitted. It doesn't feel like home anymore. Alice closed her eyes briefly, because part of her still remembered loving him, deeply, dangerously. But love without safety eventually became grief. Jason spoke again. I keep thinking about us before everything got ugly. Alice looked out across the glittering city lights. It was already ugly, she whispered. I just kept pretending it wasn't. Jason inhaled shakily. Alice. She heard it then. The loneliness, real loneliness. Not fear of scandal, not fear of consequences, loss. And somehow that hurt more than hatred would have. Then Jason said quietly, Can I see you? Alice froze. Silence stretched painfully between them. Finally, she answered, No. Jason sounded destroyed by the word. Alice, please. She tightened her grip on the phone. For years, she whispered, I begged you to see me. Jason stopped breathing for a second, and now he asked quietly. Alice looked around her apartment, her peaceful apartment, her new life, her returning self. Now I finally see myself. Then she ended the call. But long after the screen went dark, Alice Tucker stood on that balcony trembling. Because healing wasn't clean, it wasn't linear, and sometimes the hardest part of freedom was accepting that the person who broke you might finally love you properly, only after it was too late. Jason showed up outside Alice's apartment on a Thursday night, carrying nothing except exhaustion. Alice saw him through the lobby security camera first. Dark coat, snow collecting on his shoulders, hands shoved into his pockets like a man trying to hold himself together physically. For a long moment, she simply stared at the screen. 3 months ago, seeing Jason waiting for her would have made her heart race with hope. Now it filled her with something far more complicated. Grief, not for the marriage, for the woman she used to be inside it. The intercom buzzed softly. Alice, the concierge, said carefully, Mr. Tucker is downstairs. Should I send him away? Alice closed her eyes briefly. Every instinct told her this was dangerous emotionally. Healing required distance, boundaries. But another part of her needed something too. Closure. Send him up. 10 minutes later, Jason stood inside her apartment looking painfully out of place. He glanced around slowly. The apartment was warm and softly lit shelves filled with books, fresh flowers near the windows, jazz music playing quietly from hidden speakers. Peace lived here now, and Jason noticed immediately. You made this place feel like you, he said quietly. Alice folded her arms loosely. What do you want? Jason looked at her for several seconds before answering. You. The word barely affected her now. That realization hurt more than it should have. Because once upon a time, hearing Jason say that would have healed entire parts of her. Now it just sounded late, very late. Alice motioned toward the living room. You have 10 minutes. Jason almost smiled sadly. You used to give me unlimited chances. Alice met his eyes calmly. And you used every single one carelessly. Silence. Jason sat slowly on the couch while Alice remained standing near the window. Distance. Intentional distance. Jason looked thinner than before. The arrogance he once wore like armor had disappeared almost completely. Corporate suspension became official 2 weeks earlier. Several business publications quietly removed him from leadership profiles. People stopped returning his calls, and Madison vanished entirely. Alice heard she moved to Miami temporarily after losing nearly every consulting contract attached to Horizon's network. Funny how quickly people disappeared once power disappeared with them. Jason rubbed his hands together slowly. I ended things with Madison. Alice's face remained expressionless. That relationship ended itself the moment consequences arrived. The truth landed hard. Jason looked down. She wasn't important. Alice almost laughed. You destroyed our marriage for someone unimportant. Jason shut his eyes briefly. When you say it like that, how else should I say it? He had no answer. The silence between them stretched painfully. Finally, Jason whispered, I hate who I became. That sentence caught Alice off guard. Not because it sounded manipulative, because it sounded honest. And honesty from Jason had become so rare, it almost felt unfamiliar. Alice looked at him carefully. For the first time in months, he wasn't defending himself, wasn't blaming her, wasn't minimizing, just sitting there looking like a man finally forced to meet himself honestly. Jason swallowed hard. I spent years thinking success mattered more than everything else. Alice stayed quiet. And somewhere along the way, his voice cracked slightly, I stopped seeing people as people. The admission hurt because it was true. Jason looked up at her slowly. You loved me when I had nothing. Alice's chest tightened unexpectedly. He continued softly. You believed in me before anyone else did. Memories surfaced painfully. Tiny apartment, cheap wine, late nights planning their future together. Jason holding her hand like she was home. Alice looked away immediately, because nostalgia was dangerous, especially when mixed with loneliness. Jason's voice grew quieter. And instead of appreciating you, he laughed bitterly. I started treating your loyalty like oxygen, something that would always be there no matter how badly I behaved. Alice felt tears sting suddenly, not because she wanted him back, because hearing him finally understand the damage almost reopened everything. You humiliated me, she whispered. Jason nodded immediately. I know. You made me feel invisible. His eyes filled instantly. I know. Alice looked at him sharply. Do you? Jason stood slowly now. Yes. His voice trembled. And that's what kills me. The room fell silent. Snow drifted outside the windows while downtown Chicago glowed softly in the distance. Jason took a careful step closer. I kept thinking you'd stay. Alice's breathing slowed, because there it was. The truth underneath everything. Not love, assumption. Jason believed Alice's devotion made abandonment impossible. You know what the worst part is, he asked quietly. Alice said nothing. I didn't realize how much you carried for me until you stopped. That shattered something inside her, because she spent years begging to be seen, and only her absence finally gave him vision. Too late, always too late. Jason looked around the apartment again. You seem happy here. Alice thought carefully before answering. Peaceful. Jason nodded slowly like the word wounded him. I used to make you peaceful. Tears burned behind Alice's eyes instantly. Yes, he did. That was what made all of this tragic instead of simple. Jason hadn't always been cruel. He became cruel slowly, comfortably, the way entitled people often did when someone loved them too unconditionally. Jason stepped closer again. I know I don't deserve another chance. Alice stayed silent, but if there's even a part of you that's still no. The interruption startled both of them. Alice's voice wasn't angry, just certain. Jason froze. Alice looked directly at him. You don't get to come back now that your life collapsed. Pain flashed openly across his face. That's not why I'm here. Then why now, she whispered. Why didn't you fight for me when I was crying myself to sleep beside you? Jason looked shattered. Because he had no answer, Alice's tears finally escaped. I begged you to notice me. Her voice trembled now, and you only noticed once someone else stopped admiring you. Jason physically flinched. Good, he should hear it. Alice wiped her face quickly. You didn't lose me because of one affair, Jason. He stared at her helplessly. You lost me because every time you had a choice between protecting my heart or feeding your ego. She swallowed painfully. You chose yourself. The silence afterward felt endless. Then Jason whispered the question Alice had feared most. Do you still love me? Her heart broke all over again, because part of her did. Maybe some part always would. You don't erase 12 years overnight. You don't erase history, or memories, or the version of someone you once built your future around. But love wasn't enough anymore, not without safety, not without respect. And finally, Alice Tucker loved herself enough to understand the difference. She looked at Jason quietly, then walked toward the hallway table. A white envelope rested there. Jason frowned slightly. Alice handed it to him carefully. He opened it slowly. Inside was her wedding ring, the same ring Madison once wore publicly like a trophy. Jason stared at it silently. Then his breathing broke completely. Alice. His voice cracked apart around her name. But Alice stepped backward gently, not cruelly, not coldly, just finally free enough to stop abandoning herself for someone else's redemption. You taught me something important, she whispered through tears. Jason looked up. Alice smiled sadly. Love should never cost a woman her dignity, and for the first time since their marriage began falling apart, Jason Tucker understood there were some losses no apology could repair. The divorce settlement was finalized on a rainy Tuesday morning in early April. No dramatic courtroom, no screaming, no cinematic collapse, just signatures, paperwork, and two people sitting across from each other realizing love had officially become history. Alice wore ivory, silk, and calmness. Jason wore exhaustion. Naomi sat beside Alice, reviewing the final documents, while Jason's attorney spoke carefully about asset distribution and confidentiality clauses. The Tucker estate would be sold. Jason retained several investment holdings under heavy financial review. Alice kept her foundation shares, independent accounts, and leadership position within the Women's Healthcare Initiative. For the first time in years, something belonged entirely to her. The mediator slid the final page across the table. "Mrs. Tucker, your signature here." Alice stared at the line for a moment. Alice Tucker. Soon even the name would change if she wanted it to. Strangely, that thought no longer frightened her. She signed calmly. Across the table, Jason watched her with hollow eyes. There was no anger left in him anymore, only regret. The kind that arrived after consequences settled permanently into someone's life. Jason signed next. And just like that, 12 years ended with ink. After the meeting, Naomi squeezed Alice's shoulder gently. "You did good." Alice let out a slow breath. "I thought I'd feel more emotional." Naomi smiled softly. "That's because you already grieved this marriage while you were still inside it." The truth of that nearly brought tears to Alice's eyes. She had spent years mourning a relationship that technically still existed. That was the hidden cruelty of emotional betrayal. By the time women finally leave, part of them has already been surviving alone for a long time. Outside the law office, rain misted softly over downtown Chicago. Naomi opened an umbrella, so she asked carefully, "How does freedom feel?" Alice looked up at the gray skyline. "Quiet." Naomi laughed. "That means peace." Maybe it did. Later that afternoon, Alice returned to her apartment and found a large envelope waiting near the concierge desk. Inside was an official invitation embossed in gold lettering. The Chicago Women's Leadership Gala. Alice Tucker, keynote speaker. Her fingers tightened slightly around the card. 6 months ago, she was being publicly humiliated by another woman wearing her wedding ring. Now people wanted to hear her speak. Life changed brutally fast sometimes. Her phone buzzed. "Dr. Caroline Hayes." "I hope you're saying yes," Caroline said immediately. Alice smiled faintly. "You already knew about this. I may have strongly encouraged the board." Alice shook her head softly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say at a leadership gala." Caroline's voice became gentle. "Tell the truth." After hanging up, Alice stood alone in her apartment, staring out across the river. The city looked different now, not because Chicago changed, because she had. For years, Alice measured her worth through how successfully she loved someone else. Now she was learning something entirely new. A woman could build a meaningful life without shrinking herself to fit inside someone else's ego. Her laptop sat open on the dining table. An unread draft email remained on the screen. To Jason Tucker. Alice had started writing it days earlier and never finished. Not a reconciliation, not revenge, closure. She sat slowly at the table and reread the unfinished message. For a long time, she simply stared at the blinking cursor. Then she began typing again. Not emotionally, not bitterly, just honestly. She wrote about grief, about loyalty, about the danger of loving someone so deeply that you disappear inside them. She wrote about forgiveness, too. Not because Jason deserved absolution, but because carrying hatred forever would chain her emotionally to the worst chapter of her life. By the time she finished, tears rested quietly along her lashes. Not painful tears, releasing tears. Alice read the email one final time, then pressed send. Far across the city, Jason Tucker sat alone inside the nearly empty Tucker house when the notification appeared on his phone. He stared at Alice's name for several seconds before opening it. And as he read, the silence inside the massive house became unbearable. Because Alice didn't attack him, that would have been easier. Instead, she gave him honesty. She thanked him for the years when he truly loved her. She acknowledged the beautiful memories without denying the ugly ending. And at the very bottom, one sentence shattered him completely. "I hope one day you become the kind of man who no longer needs to destroy love in order to feel powerful." Jason read the line 3 times, then slowly lowered the phone. The house around him looked lifeless now. Cold marble, expensive furniture, empty rooms echoing with consequences. For years, Jason thought success meant admiration, money, status, attention. Now he understood too late that the most valuable thing he ever had was the woman who loved him before he became someone difficult to love. and he traded her for ego. Jason walked upstairs slowly toward the bedroom that no longer felt like home. Alice's side of the closet stood empty now. No perfume, no soft sweaters, no traces of warmth, just absence. And absence was finally teaching him what her presence once protected him from: loneliness. Meanwhile, across the city, Alice stood before her bedroom mirror, trying on dresses for the gala. Soft navy silk, elegant, simple. She smiled faintly at her reflection. Not because she looked perfect, because she finally looked like herself again. Her phone buzzed with another notification. "Naomi, you sent the email, didn't you?" Alice smiled. "Yes." "Feel better?" Alice thought carefully before answering. Then typed, "I feel free." That night, Alice stepped onto her balcony wrapped in a blanket while spring rain shimmered across Chicago below. The air smelled clean, new. For years, she believed endings meant failure. Now she understood something different. Sometimes endings were rescue, and sometimes the bravest thing a woman could do was walk away before love destroyed her identity completely. Inside her apartment, the gala invitation rested on the table beneath glowing city lights. A new chapter waiting patiently for her to step into it. And this time, Alice Tucker would walk into it as herself. Not somebody's wife, not somebody's sacrifice, herself. The ballroom glowed gold beneath crystal chandeliers while Chicago's elite filled the annual Women's Leadership Gala in gowns, tuxedos, and carefully curated confidence. 6 months ago, Alice Tucker would have entered a room like this standing half a step behind Jason. Tonight she walked in alone, and somehow, she had never looked more powerful. Soft navy silk draped elegantly against her figure, her hair swept back, simply diamond earrings catching the warm light as conversations quieted subtly around her. Not because she was Jason Tucker's wife anymore, because people had finally started seeing her. Dr. Caroline Hayes greeted her near the stage. "You nervous?" Alice laughed softly. "Terrified." "Good," Caroline said warmly. "That means you care." Across the ballroom, donors and executives gathered near candlelit tables while cameras flashed occasionally beside the event backdrop. Alice recognized some faces immediately. People who once ignored her at corporate dinners now smiled with admiration. Funny how quickly the world respected women once they stopped apologizing for existing. Naomi approached carrying champagne. "There's my emotionally devastating keynote speaker." Alice rolled her eyes affectionately. "You make me sound dangerous." Naomi smirked. "You are dangerous now." A pause. "You finally know your worth." The sentence settled deep inside her. Worth. For years, Alice searched for it inside marriage, inside sacrifice, inside loyalty. Now she understood something life-changing. Self-worth built through suffering was fragile. Real self-worth came from refusing to abandon yourself for love. An event coordinator approached carefully. "They're ready for you backstage." Alice inhaled slowly. Her heartbeat thundered, not from fear of speaking, from the realization that this moment symbolized everything she survived to become. Backstage, soft piano music drifted through the curtains, while applause echoed from the ballroom. Alice stood alone briefly, staring at the speech cards in her hands. Then she noticed movement near the rear entrance. Madison Cole. Alice froze slightly. Madison stood near the shadows wearing a simple black dress completely unlike the glamorous woman who once walked through Horizon Healthcare like she owned the world. No designer arrogance, no sharp confidence, just quietness. For a long moment, neither woman moved. Then Madison stepped forward carefully. "I almost didn't come." Alice said nothing. Madison looked nervous. Actually nervous. That alone felt surreal. "I heard you were speaking tonight." Madison continued softly, and Her voice broke slightly. Alice watched her carefully. Madison looked thinner now. Tired. Human. Consequences had stripped away the performance both women once hated each other inside. "I wanted to say I'm sorry." The words hung heavily in the air. Alice didn't answer immediately, because apologies were complicated. They didn't erase humiliation, or betrayal, or nights spent questioning your own value. But sometimes apologies mattered anyway. Madison swallowed hard. "I told myself you were weak," she admitted quietly. "It made me feel less guilty." Alice looked at her calmly, and now Madison gave a broken laugh. "Now I think you were the strongest person in the room while the rest of us were busy performing." Silence settled between them. Not warm, not friendly, but honest. Madison looked down briefly. He doesn't stop talking about you. Alice's chest tightened unexpectedly. Jason, always Jason, somewhere inside the ruins. Madison continued softly. I don't think he understood what he had until you stopped loving him. Alice looked away toward the ballroom lights glowing through the curtains. That happens to a lot of women. Madison nodded slowly, then quietly whispered, I hope you know none of this happened because you weren't enough. That sentence hit harder than Alice expected, because deep down every betrayed woman secretly wonders the same thing. What was wrong with me? Alice finally looked back at Madison. There was never anything wrong with me. Madison smiled sadly. I know. The event coordinator appeared again moments later. Ms. Tucker, we're ready. Alice nodded once. Then Madison stepped aside silently, and for the first time since all this began, Alice felt no hatred toward her, because Madison was never truly the enemy. The real enemy was the version of Alice who once believed love required self-erasure. The applause began as Alice stepped onto the stage. Warm, powerful, real. Hundreds of faces looked toward her beneath golden light, while Chicago's skyline glittered through towering ballroom windows behind the stage. Alice stood at the podium quietly for a moment, then she smiled softly. 6 months ago, she began. I thought my life was ending. The ballroom fell completely silent. Alice continued calmly. I built my identity around being needed by other people, around sacrifice, around proving my loyalty over and over until I forgot something important. She paused briefly. How to belong to myself. Several women in the audience visibly emotional already. Alice saw it, felt it, because women recognized pain that sounded familiar. For years, she continued, I confused endurance with love. Silence. Then softly, but love should never require someone to disappear. The words echoed through the ballroom like truth finally spoken aloud. Alice's throat tightened slightly. She thought about the old version of herself, the woman crying silently in bathrooms, begging to feel chosen, accepting disrespect because she feared losing love. I stayed too long in places that hurt me because I thought being understanding made me strong. She smiled faintly. But eventually I learned something life-changing. Alice looked out across the audience. A woman who finally values herself becomes impossible to manipulate. Applause broke out immediately. Strong, emotional. Alice swallowed tears carefully. She wasn't speaking as a victim anymore. She was speaking as someone who survived herself. My marriage ending did not destroy me, she said softly. Losing myself inside that marriage almost did. Several women openly wiped tears now. Even some men looked shaken. Because deep down, everybody knew someone who slowly abandoned themselves trying to keep love alive. Alice glanced toward the back of the ballroom unintentionally, and there he was, Jason, standing silently near the rear entrance, watching her. His expression shattered her heart quietly, not because she wanted him back, because she could see clearly now that he finally understood her value. Too late, always too late. Jason looked devastated, but also proud, and somehow that made everything ache all over again. Alice steadied herself, then smiled gently toward the audience. If anyone listening tonight is staying somewhere that constantly asks you to shrink your voice, your dreams, your worth, she paused carefully. Please remember this. The room became perfectly silent. Love is not supposed to cost you your identity. The applause this time became overwhelming. People stood, clapping, some crying openly. Alice stepped back from the podium, overwhelmed by the sound. Not validation, liberation. Because for the first time in her life, Alice Tucker was being celebrated for who she truly was, not for how well she supported someone else. Later that evening, after the gala ended, Alice stepped outside into cool spring air, overlooking the glowing Chicago skyline. The city hummed below like possibility itself. A man from the foundation board approached her gently. Kind eyes, warm smile. Your speech was incredible, he said. Alice smiled politely. Thank you. He hesitated slightly. I'd love to take you to dinner sometime. Old Alice might have rushed to fill the silence. To please. To be chosen. But this version of Alice simply smiled softly. Maybe someday. Not because she was afraid of love, because she no longer needed it to prove she mattered. As the man walked away, Alice looked out across the city one final time, and for the first time in years, she felt whole. Not because someone loved her, because she finally loved herself enough to walk away from anyone who didn't. After everything Alice Tucker survived, she learned a truth many women spend years trying to understand. Kindness is not weakness. Loyalty is not permission for betrayal. And loving deeply should never require destroying yourself to keep someone else comfortable. Sometimes the hardest heartbreak isn't losing another person. It's realizing how long you abandoned yourself trying to be enough for someone who had already stopped valuing you. Healing didn't happen overnight for Alice. Some mornings still hurt, some memories still lingered, but pain stopped controlling her once she finally understood that self-respect is stronger than attachment. Jason losing Alice wasn't karma because he lost a wife. It was karma because he lost the one person who loved him before success status and ego changed him into someone empty. And Alice, she didn't win because Jason suffered. She won because she found herself again. So if you're listening to this while holding on to a relationship that constantly breaks your spirit, let this be your reminder you are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to leave what hurts you, and the moment you stop begging for love that dishonors you, your healing begins. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments. What was the moment you finally chose yourself? And if you believe emotional stories like this deserve more space in the world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who may need it tonight.